Economics correspondent Paul Salman explores a particularly vexing question for Americans at the moment. You might call it the paradox of thrift.
The American savings rate is rising fast, from an abysmal near zero or below just a few years ago, up past 4% in January and February. Well, it's about time, you might think. And yet, by definition, saving means not spending, and spending is what we supposedly need right now. Need desperately. So, to save or not to save? That is the question. It's a debate that last raged during the Great Depression, when the English economist John Maynard Keynes coined a phrase again in vogue: the paradox of thrift. But what does it mean, we asked one of our favorite living English economists, MIT's Simon Johnson.
Paradox of thrift is the idea that everyone tries to increase their savings, so desired savings goes up, thrift being savings, but the act of trying to save pulls down the entire economy, gives you a big recession or maybe even a depression, and total savings don't go up, maybe they even go down. So everyone trying to save leads to a big slowdown and less savings. That's a paradox.
As it happens, a very old paradox. Back in the 1700s, at the dawn of the market system, when Handel was writing this music for England's King George I, Bernard Mandeville was scandalizing London with this satire in verse, The Grumbling Hive. The poem, a fable about bees, was meant as a diatribe against virtue and especially saving. Once upon a time, a beehive hummed, Mandeville wrote, by splurging, borrowing, cheating.
Every part was full of vice, yet the whole mass a paradise.
Mandeville's point: the hive prospered not despite the vice, but because of it. Now, at this very moment in English history, the economy of Mandeville's London was being visually mocked by English artist William Hogarth. So, to continue with Hogarth's pictures and Mandeville's words, the bees, when they spent on
luxury, employed 1 million of the poor. Envy itself and vanity were ministers of industry.
In other words, keeping up with the Joneses made everyone better off. But what if both we and the Joneses decide to cut back?
We employ a lot of people through the things we buy, and we have them come, clean our cars, or we ask them to cook meals for us in a restaurant rather than cooking at home. And that economy, those interactions, that market is all about going out and spending. If you decide to stay home and not spend one weekend, that's totally fine. The movie industry will probably hardly notice. But if everybody decides that movies are an unbearable luxury, or even something not virtuous, that would be even worse. Then the movie industry would collapse.
If everybody saves, that is. But in the 1700s, savings was a virtue.
If you would be wealthy, think of saving more than getting.
I once lunched with a Ben Franklin reenactor who indulged me with one of the 1700s' most famous sound bites.
Penny saved is a penny earned.
But enough living history. Let's return to what TV folks actually call B-roll, the video that covers narration. Mandeville's bees thrived as spendthrifts, and by neglecting the words of the most famous English bard, neither a borrower nor a lender be. Thrived by borrowing and spending, that is, until Ben Franklin's so-called Protestant ethic came to infect the hive. Imagine that Mandeville's bees are downshifting to thrift, beginning ever so virtuously to
sell stately horses by whole sets, and country houses to pay debts. Vain cost is shunned as much as fraud. They have no forces kept abroad.
In other words, the bees were saving instead of borrowing and spending. Just what some, like pension expert Dallas Salisbury, advocate now.
Saving aggressively is probably at the individual level and the household level more clearly important and necessary than at any time in the last several decades.
But doesn't saving aggressively aggravate the downturn? As the savings rate climbed in the last quarter of 2008, the economy shrank by 6%. If we'd returned to the average savings rate that prevailed back in the 1970s, 10%, the economy would have shrunk by double digits. making it an official depression. This is just what happened to the busy bees in Mandeville's satire. The newfound thrift of the once profligate arthropods brought the bees to their knees. And
multitudes that lived on them were daily forced to do the same. In vain to other trades they'd fly. The price of land and houses falls. Artificers are not employed.
the point of the fable, saving created the kind of vicious spiral we're seeing today. So in the end, are people saving too aggressively? Dallas Salisbury's still pushing thrift. Paradox or no?
You'd better take care of your own situation. You better focus on you. You'd better be more concerned about your family's financial situation and not be doing things that are somehow maybe going to be terrible for you, even if they're good for the country.
As personal finance advice, even Simon Johnson doesn't really disagree.
Some people have too much debt. Some people have to cut back, particularly because it's becoming harder and harder to roll over your debt. Credit card debt for many people has become more expensive. Now, there are other people in the economy who don't face those kinds of constraints. Don't panic. Don't think you've got to pay off all your debts. That would not be appropriate in these circumstances.
Because it would make things worse, warned Bernard Mandeville, and then John Maynard Keynes, who cited Mandeville in his arguments of the 1930s, fearing the consequences of a sudden surge in saving. It's the same thing some people worry about today: the reappearance of the paradox of thrift.